welcome to our video. So today we're going to talk about how to prepare for a SOC readiness assessment and a SOC examination. So my name is Sarah Kumar. I'm a senior manager at Moss Adams in our IT Risk Advisory and Compliance Department with a focus in our SOC practice. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Raveen real quick for an introduction.
Thanks, Priya. My name is Raveen Pasine. I'm a senior manager here at Moss Adams as well, IT Risk and Compliance based out of the Central Region with a focus on SOC reporting for healthcare, financial services, and technology firms.
Right. So before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and read this disclaimer right here. So the material appearing in this presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as advice of any kind, including without limitation, legal, accounting, or investment advice. This information is not intended to create, and receipt does not constitute a legal relationship, including but not limited to an accountant-client relationship. Although this information may have been prepared by professionals, it should not be used as a substitute for professional services. If legal, accounting, investment, or other professional advice is required, the services of a professional should be sought. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So today we're going to talk about readiness assessment. So what is the purpose of a readiness assessment? An assessment is designed to assist a service organization to assess how prepared they are for a SOC examination. So regardless of whether a company is looking to get a SOC 1 or a SOC 2, there are processes that need to be walked through and documented and controls that need to be identified. So instead of initially looking at all these processes and controls during the period under review, whether you're looking at a type 2 or a type 1, the readiness assessment takes a look at those controls before the time of the actual examination to walk through and clearly document what are those processes that are in place, help identify what are those key controls that need to be included in the actual examination. So you can consider it more or less a dry run of an actual examination. Another key aspect of the readiness assessment is helping identify any weaknesses that could preclude having any unqualified opinion in the SOC examination or having findings show up in the report in the testing section. So the readiness gives you that opportunity to identify and remediate those gaps before you actually even get into the SOC examination. So to first get started on the readiness, you first want to understand and identify what is the scope. So what services area of your organization do you want included in the report? Then you want to identify the sub-service organizations that are utilized to assist in your service offering. For example, you could be leveraging a cloud provider like AWS to host your system, or you could be outsourcing a business function for your service like billing or payment processing. Then you want to identify what are those control activities to satisfy either that control objective, if we're talking SOC 2, or the control criteria, if we're talking SOC 2, as control objectives if we're talking SOC 1. In order to assess the design of the control activities, not only do we want to make sure we have the right process owners who can speak to what those activities actually are, but we also want to see sample evidence to ensure that you formally document the process that you're stating and that it aligns with your said process and that it'll actually suffice for the examination. Once you go through that process, you'll be able to compile a list of controls as well as a list of gaps. And so when we say gaps, these are either activities that are not in place that need to be implemented or activities that may be in place, but they're just not being formally documented right now. So then when you identify what those lists of gaps are, you want to create a remediation plan. And then each plan should detail the steps and what those deliverables are to satisfy the control standard. And then lastly, one of the aspects that you'll want to talk through is preparing the report narrative. And we'll dive into this a little bit more in the next few slides. And so as we mentioned throughout today so far, we've mentioned a lot about controls. So one thing to note about controls is that there isn't really a defined number of what an organization is expected to have. Ultimately, it comes down to the nature of the service being provided, the type of operating environment one has, the type of SOC report that you're looking to pursue, and as well as customer expectations, just to name a few. So when you look at a SOC 2, it's more security heavy, so making up mostly IT controls, whereas if you're looking at a SOC 1, IT controls may only make up 1/3 of the total controls in comparison to the business process controls that you have in place. So again, there really is no ideal number here to strive for. The key factor is that you have controls in place to satisfy either the objective or the criteria. And so onto the next slide, a next important aspect to keep in mind when you're designing controls is you want to understand what controls already exist and then what additional controls you may need to have and implement. Depending on the extent of what those gaps are and the resources that you have to remediate said gaps, this may play a big part in driving timing for your actual SOC examination. So now I'll turn it over to Raveen to talk a little bit more about defining controls.
Thanks, Priya. And so let's talk about how do you go about defining your controls. So control activities typically are key points within your existing processes that you want to define and use within your SOC report. So where do you go about looking for these, right? So your customer contracts, your SOWs, MSAs typically have sections that outline your responsibilities and the customer's responsibilities as part of that contract. That's a good place to start looking. You also might have RFPs that you respond to or you send out yourself that might have key control points identified within them. Any due diligence questionnaires that you're filling out or providing your vendors and or your customers, compliance forms, quality control, internal audits, be those financial audits or more technical security related ones if it's a SOC 2, things like vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, things of that nature will also be components of this, and any other inputs or reports that you rely upon. So all of these things can be good basis for identifying your key controls, making sure you've got the areas identified. If you're doing a SOC 1, then you obviously want to look at your business process as well and understand where the key control points lay within those. Once you have a solid outline, you can go ahead and start building upon that. The review of the wording and the presentation of those controls is something that you would collaborate with your readiness assessment consultant, aka examiner potentially, and make sure you're wording them appropriately and you're identifying the key components. And then, of course, as part of this whole process of defining your controls, you want to ensure that management has a reasonable basis to assert the design and the effectiveness of those controls over the course of the examination period. So you don't want to have controls that are kind of, pie in the sky and you have no means of actually proving their existence. You want to make sure that you have some basis to be able to demonstrate that those controls operated effectively for the period. So with that said, we've talked about kind of how many controls and what controls are and how do you go about identifying and defining them. What are some of the areas that you can go looking for them? Let's talk about the biggest section of the SOC report for the most part. It's the third section, which is the report narrative or management's description of the system. And over on the right-hand side, you see the COSO framework. This is important both from a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 perspective. From a SOC 2 perspective, you typically lay out your narrative to define the control environment, the risk assessment, the control activities, information and communication, as well as monitoring activities across your operations, your reporting and compliance efforts at the entity, division, operating unit, and functional levels. I know that's a lot of words to process, but really what I'm trying to say here is you're essentially going to lay out, and you can probably see it on the example on the left, a lot of your narrative to kind of mimic this COSO framework so that you're covering off the appropriate topics and appropriate areas, and you're covering off all the processes that support the functioning of your system of internal controls and the processes that go behind the scenes in making sure your environment's operating effectively and functional. And the reason why you want to do that is because at the end of the day, your customers want to have a deeper insight as to how you operate and how those controls fit into the environment. Are there components of those controls don't cover that are technically within scope but are not covered by those controls? So those are types of things you want to define here. You also want to define your sub-service organizations, which are the key critical external vendors that provide services that are critical to the delivery of your service itself. And so those could be, like Priya had mentioned, things like AWS and Azure and many others. And then that's obviously a conversation you would have as part of the readiness assessment as well. So continuing with this, from a narrative perspective, you want to ensure you're covering off things like infrastructure, software, procedures, people, and data. Just kind of dive a little bit deeper into that. From an infrastructure perspective, you want to ensure you're covering up things like how do you introduce new infrastructure, how do you maintain and patch existing infrastructure, what's your decommissioning process for infrastructure, and also just ongoing management and administration of that infrastructure. From a software perspective, if you're developing software in-house, you want to look at SDLC. Beyond that, you want to look at your change management processes. How are you tracking changes? Are changes tested? What does the approval process look like? Are you following DevOps, CI/CD? All of those things kind of play into this, and you define your narrative and your controls accordingly. Procedurally, again, these are just the underlying procedures that support the functioning of all these controls. So you're making sure you're defining all of those. From a people perspective, you're looking at some of the HR type controls, which would be onboarding, training, retaining, and then termination and offboarding of individuals such as employees and contractors. So you want to make sure you have those covered off as well. And then from a data perspective, you're typically talking about how you're protecting data, what classification you're using for data, what the retention periods are. Is data encrypted in transit? Is it encrypted at rest? What kind of controls do you have around that? And so you're going to be defining your narrative, building out the processes, and identifying the controls around data as well. So that's the overall kind of lay of the land from a SOC reporting perspective. I know we've tried to cover off what we could argue is a pretty healthy chunk in a short period of time. And so with that said, I'm sure there are follow-up questions. Both Priya and I are available to answer any questions you might have. Our contact information is on screen. Feel free to reach out via email or phone call. Leave us a message. We're happy to have a follow-up conversation when it comes to SOC reporting or anything else risk and compliance related. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for watching our video today.